Hello, good evening. Welcome to Novara Live. My name is Aaron Bastani, and tonight, I, of course, have the pleasure, the privilege, the joy of being joined by the one and only Kieran Andrieu. Kieran, how are we?
Well, very good, Aaron. Delighted to be joining you as always. I always feel like I say I'm good or I'm less good or I'm very good. I want us today mix it up a bit. What's your favourite film of all time, Aaron?
This time of year, it has to be It's a Wonderful Life.
Very good.
Has
Very
to
good.
be. You?
Any time of year, The Godfather Part 2. But I do love It's a Wonderful Life.
Normally I'd say that, Kieran. We are so alike. I'm going to say It's a Wonderful Life because, not many people know this, but the lead actor in that was allegedly channeling PTSD, which he had from the Second World War when he was at his lowest ebb. And he's literally praying to God, Jimmy Stewart. I don't want to ruin it for some people. He's praying to God, please, God, help me. And he's crying. And allegedly that was him. That was not planned. It was not expected. And it was an outpouring of grief that allegedly, some say, been bottled up from his participation in the Second World War. You can say many things about Marlon Brando or Al Pacino or Robert De Niro, but, they'd never reckoned with something like that personally, had they?
Quite true. They had Marlon Brando had a very stressful childhood, very distressing childhood, which he then canalized and used as part of his kind of method acting approach. But yes, you're right. They didn't go to war. They were lucky enough to not be part of that generation.
And I hope we're lucky enough and our children are lucky enough. And maybe for some watching, your grandchildren too are lucky enough to never go to war. As ever, we don't just talk about films on this channel, you might know. If you'd like to support our work here at Novara Media, you can sign up and help build a new media for different politics. Go to novaramedia.com/support. As ever, I want to know what you think. This show is all about you. It's all about Novara's viewers and supporters. Give us some feedback. Let us know what your thoughts using the comments here in the YouTube chat. Before we start with tonight's show, an extra special mention. We have some new merch. Look at that. Beautiful. You might recognize the design of this parody t-shirt from your friends, the Novara Broadcasting Company. I won't say NBC because, of course, that's an American media brand. You can pick up these wonderful items of merch over at shop.novaramedia.com. Get it now so it arrives in time for Christmas. Do not miss out. We, of course, have many other wonderful bits of merch, vestments, accoutrements, including this t-shirt. This is all I wear. I have a colleague, Harriet. She said to me earlier today, we need to get that t-shirt in other colors for you, Aaron. It's all you wear. It's true. It's all I wear, partly because I work at Novara, but also because it's organic. The supply chains are great. The printers are unionized. The producers of this in Bangladesh are part of a really ethical supply chain. They get a living wage. It's accredited in terms of being a Global South employer. Why would I go and buy some crap when I can get the most ethical, most comfortable t-shirt there is? If you are thinking, hey, I might do the same. As I mentioned already, go to shop.novaramedia.com. A basic principle of justice in Britain is that in many cases, it should be your peers rather than the establishment that judges you. We're all subject to the law, but that principle recognizes that it should be people like you rather than those who come from wealth and privilege are employed by the state, who decide whether you are guilty of breaking it. Ordinary people are likely to be more sensitive to real-life circumstances and opinions than judges. Involving them in cases also lends the legal system more generally legitimacy, placing checks on judicial power and ensuring continual public confidence in our justice system as a whole. But today, Justice Secretary David Lammy said, meh, screw all that.
This government inherited an emergency in our courts. A record of rising backlog, currently at 78,000 cases. Victims facing agonising delays, with some trials not listed for years. First, I will create new swift courts within the Crown Court, with a judge alone deciding verdicts in triable either way cases with a likely sentence of 3 years or less.
The new policy will affect a range of cases that are called either way cases. At present, if a defendant is charged with an either way offence, they get to decide whether they want a jury trial in the Crown Court, that's the Old Bailey, all the bells and whistles, or a magistrate's court. In other words, it's part of the legal process that a defendant and not a judge decides where they think their defense will have the most chance of success. But if Lammy's plans go ahead, it will be judges who decide where the case should be heard. Those facing sentences of less than 18 months will go to magistrates' courts, where sentencing powers will be increased from 1 year to 1.5 years, 18 months. Meanwhile, those with longer sentences of up to 3 years will be heard by a judge in the Crown Court sitting without a jury, which is essentially a brand new kind of criminal trial. It's at odds with hundreds of years of how we do things in this country. The kinds of charges that will be denied jury trials include many burglary and theft cases, drug possession, and a range of assault charges, ABH and GBH as well. Also amongst them, however, will be cases involving the right to protest, an issue that Labour's Sarah Russell raised in Parliament.
I have immense sympathy for the difficult position that the Lord Chancellor is in and that the many victims of crime in our country are in. There are, however, a category of offences relating to the right to protest, and the right to protest has been restricted by multiple governments over time. It is very important that we maintain the involvement of jury trials within anything touching on that area. Can the Lord Chancellor commit to retaining jury trials where either the current offence potential imprisonment would be such that at the moment it would be an either way offence, or where they're currently explicitly either way? So would currently go to the Crown Court, or where they would be either way?
Justice Secretary.
Well, I recognise that in that category of those who are sentenced to beyond 18 months that would now sit with the magistrates and up to 3 years, there will be a range of cases. But I do believe that determination now must be left to our magistrates and judiciary to make that appropriate determination.
There is potentially one positive change in the policy. Complicated fraud and financial cases, which may carry sentences much longer than 3 years, will also be heard without a jury, which kind of makes sense to me anyway. Those cases often drag on for a very long time, and they tend to involve highly technical aspects of accounting, the banking system, and the law. And one might say that that's the kind of thing that requires experts rather than ordinary people. A layperson will generally struggle with that stuff. Lammy's reason for getting rid of jury trials involves a pretty shocking backlog of cases overall in the criminal justice system. The dark blue line that you can see there shows the growth in the number of jury cases waiting to be heard, with that total now having grown to around 78,000 since the pandemic. The light blue line adjusts those cases for complexity, weighting them depending on how much court time they're expected to need. Now, using that measure, in reality, the backlog is more like 110,000 normal cases, which is just crazy. And very much a post-pandemic thing. That also has a very real impact on defendants who may wait years to clear their names. And of course, it naturally affects victims too. A fact that Lammy was keen to stress on Good Morning Britain.
Ditching a valuable tradition for the short-term benefit of speeding up and unclogging a court system.
Susanna, you're absolutely right to centre victims in all of this. If sadly you're raped today, you will wait until 2028, maybe 2029, for your case to be heard. And it's why 60% of rape victims are dropping out in relation to their case.
But the question is, will abandoning jury trials for lesser offences mean trials for greater offences are heard more quickly? That's what Lammy is effectively arguing. The evidence doesn't suggest so. Only about 3% of criminal trials currently involve a jury at all. Halving the number of jury trials means that 1.5% of all criminal trials might move a little faster. You might think that's better than nothing, but that doesn't sound like it'll have much impact on how quickly a rape victim, for instance, gets justice. A Doughty Street Chambers barrister and member of the House of Lords, Helena Kennedy, was asked what she thought of Lammy's arguments on Times Radio.
David Lammy is doing a media round this morning, and he's highlighting the case of somebody who may or may not be raped. And he keeps repeating this idea that if you're raped in London today or this evening, then you may not have your case heard for until 2028, and that is the reason.
Shame on him. I mean, shame on him. The way to answer that is to make sure that cases involving sexual violence on women and the trauma that goes with that should be absolutely given the highest priority in the earliest possible date. You don't have somebody waiting for 3 years for that. You know, that's a nonsense.
Is he letting those women down?
Well, I just think that he's perpetuating a myth. There are plenty of other ways of dealing with that, and so he's really not being, I think, creative in his thinking and not hearing the right. I mean, he's not. Listen, David Lammy may have qualified as a lawyer as a young man, but he's never practiced in the courts, and he's never had the experience that many experienced criminal lawyers have.
I love that, right? He's a qualified lawyer. He went to Harvard, but he's not really a lawyer. He's one of those people that studied law so that he could enter politics. That's basically what David Lammy is, right? It's like acting. He might as well have gone to RADA. He went to RADA for lawyers because ultimately he wants to be a politician and have the credibility to do something precisely like this. He's never been a working lawyer. Kennedy was also asked where she thought these reforms would lead.
This would be the end of jury trial, because once you start down this road of taking a side to the right to jury trial, it's going to be almost inevitable that it will end up being judge-alone trials that will be advocated by those who don't like jury trial at all. And it's usually those who actually take a rather sort of snooty view of the general public's ability to try a case. And, you know, we have, I won't name the names, but they exist within the law. And it's no wonder that people start talking about elitists who get to make the decisions. This is one of the great values of our system, in that juries come from the community. They are the ordinary public who come in and, in fact, lend their experience, their diversity, their different age groups, what they know about drugs on the street, what they know about gangs, what they know, which I have to tell you, most of our judges don't. And what happens with judges, and I have the greatest of admiration, because I think we have the greatest judiciary in the world. But one of the problems is that in the criminal courts, you can get case hardening. They're hearing cases over and over again. It happens with magistrates too, I'm afraid. But case hardening can mean that the person who has an answer to an allegation is not listened to, because the assumption is they're all at it. You know, stealing phones is a crisis at the moment. They're all doing it, and so the person who's innocent gets swept up in that.
It's very unusual to hear an argument for the common person. Of course, that's certainly not made by our politicians. There's one important feature of jury trials that will also be swept away with these reforms. That's a feature of British law, or English and Welsh law, called jury equity, and it's been around since 1670. It means that a jury can acquit a defendant even if they are clearly guilty, and even if the judge directs them to find the defendant guilty. It's the principle that has led to protesters, particularly direct action protesters, being acquitted on grounds of conscience or necessity despite having committed the crime they're charged with. That is, of course, how the Colston Four walked free after they argued they had prevented a greater crime by pulling down the statue, of course, of Colston, who was a slave trader in Bristol. The same happened with many Extinction Rebellion activists, including an Anglican priest who obstructed the railway during rush hour. And in past cases, Palestine Action activists have also been acquitted using that same principle, the jury equity principle. Indeed, it's thanks to jury equity that Prime Minister Keir Starmer got some of his very own clients off in those long ago days when he actually cared about human rights. But judges and politicians absolutely hate this principle. Judges have increasingly used their powers to prevent defendants making defences in court that might trigger the jurors to acquit on grounds of equity. And they've also instructed people not to tell jurors they have the power to acquit on conscience. Quite extraordinary. In 2023, a retired social worker, Trudy Warner, was arrested after she stood outside a London Crown Court for 30 minutes, holding a sign saying, quote, "Jurors, you have an absolute right to acquit according to your conscience." She was relentlessly pursued through the courts by the government for informing juries of a perfectly legal thing to do, of that right, after the judge referred her action to the Attorney General for contempt of court. This is crazy. Can you imagine this happening in the United States? Eventually, the case was thrown out, but only after an 18-month-long legal ordeal. And you might say, well, justice was done. And it was. But if you do something which is perfectly legal, you are exercising your right to free speech, you are informing jurors of a basis by which they can acquit people, right? You are legally telling other people how to legally do something, and then you're dragged through an 18-month legal ordeal. You know what? You're probably not going to do that again. And that's the point. The process is the punishment. Kieran, we're not getting rid of all jury trials. And, the devil is in the detail. One might make an argument that, magistrates should be able to deal with cases that go potentially 18-month sentences rather than a year. Maybe that could expedite things. I don't know. What is really striking with all this to me anyway, is that there is an argument post-COVID to say, you know what, we need to expedite this process. We need to get those weights down. We need to deal with the backlog. This is how we're going to do things for 5 years. I wouldn't make that argument, but I can understand that argument. So you would introduce legislation with a sunset clause. They're not doing that. So for me, that demonstrates that this is not about dealing with the backlog. They think this is simply a better way of administering justice.
Yeah, and first of all, I would say, David Lammy was asked about the sunset clause today and specifically said, no, that's not what we're doing here. This is a permanent change. Even if there were a sunset clause, I personally would be worried that it wouldn't mean anything because it would set a precedent. And very often when these precedents are set, things like sunset clauses aren't respected further down the line if they seem to be clearing technocratic or administrative kind of backlogs and meeting technocratic criteria. And I think really that speaks to the heart of this entire thing. I think it's a very flawed attempt at applying technocracy to a very old kind of time-worn principle of the law. And it, as Helena Kennedy and others have said, and as indeed you said, Aaron, it tilts the scales very firmly away from peer, jury by peer, or criminal justice system in which the peer element is central and towards experts, judges, obviously, in this case. And that's fine if what you're dealing with, if your unit of analysis is stem cell research or quantum physics or any number of other examples, then fine. Experts should be in charge. But people standing trial for crimes will have in their wake a great litany of kind of social realities that can't be understood in many cases by any one individual, and almost certainly in most cases can't be understood by judges from, in many cases, privileged backgrounds. Not all, but privileged backgrounds. There are, I've got nothing against judges in per se. There are multiple cases. One springs to mind is the New Cross fire, in which a very upper class judge called Lord Scarman was deployed to lead the inquest into that and actually surprised everybody with the excoriating criticisms of the police that he arrived at. But and another that springs to mind as well is the Macpherson inquest into Stephen Lawrence's murder and institutionalized racism in the Metropolitan Police. But the key difference is those judges who were, very much of the establishment, one in 1981, one in 1998, they got out into the communities that they were supposed to be presiding over or forming judgments on the basis of. They were put out into those communities. They spent a lot of time embedded with the kinds of people that are affected by the kinds of phenomena that they were looking at. So there's a big difference there. As others have said, the jury of peers is a check and a balance against two areas, I think, of state overreach. One, a legislative area of state overreach, which is to say, it was referenced earlier by a Labour MP, no less, that at the moment, the right to protest is clearly under attack and is being curtailed. So the jury of peers is able to understand that in context and not necessarily apply the law bluntly. Equity, as you referenced a moment ago, Aaron. And then the second area is a judicial area. I think that it's very clear that judges are they're employed by the state. And so I think it isn't too much of a leap to suggest that they are ipso facto more susceptible to pressure from the state in the scenario where there is a slide towards a more authoritarian state of affairs. And just I think a quick thought experiment as well is necessary. I don't really understand. to me, this seems screamingly obvious. If you have trial by jury for the most serious crimes, i.e. those that are expected to deliver a sentence of 3 years or over, then presumably we are still sticking with the view that trial by jury is more effective than, or is a better form of litigating these cases than trial by a single judge. Well, if that's the case, then we are genuinely accepting, by extension, that that anything under 3 years is going to receive an inferior form of judgment. And that, maybe I'm missing something. You can tell me if I am, Aaron. But that seems to me to be very clearly a two-tier operation and two-tier treatment of the criminal justice system and of the legal system in this country, which I think is very, very disquieting. A final thing I'll say is that the jury system has historically, in this country alone and in many countries, but let's just take the UK as an example, has historically led to the abolition of overly punitive, unjust or draconian laws. An example is, in the 19th century, you could be sentenced to death for theft. And in the end, that was taken off the statute. That was abolished. Death penalty was abolished as a punishment for theft. Not because of any kind of arrival at collective consciousness or, greater kind of sense of injustice around it by the ruling class or the elites, but because juries routinely refused to convict obviously guilty parties because they knew that the punishment was going to be death. So they were acquitting obviously guilty people. That then led the state to drop the death penalty as a punishment for theft.
Yeah, I think this is a really significant part of the argument, which you won't really hear in much of the mainstream media, which is if you don't believe in jury trials, you don't believe in democracy. We had this debate hundreds of years ago during the Enlightenment, and you had people like Condorcet, a French Enlightenment philosopher, effectively having a mathematical theorem defending juries. So a large-ish group of people, and of course you have the mathematical formula trying to arrive at what is the optimal number of people on a jury, of middling intelligence will arrive at better conclusions than a very smart single individual. And we talk about this today using the phrase wisdom of crowds. It's kind of been a bit, how can I say? It's kind of been a bit warped in the whole digital era. Big tech kind of appropriated that rhetoric. But effectively, large groups of people can make very good decisions. And we think about that specifically with juries. It's a quintessentially democratic way of determining whether or not somebody is guilty. And it's also technocratic, okay? So in our present political debates, we say often, or we hear, I should really say, we've got democracy on the one side, what the people want, and we've got technocracy on the other. And technocracy is often at odds with what the people want. But if you look at Condorcet's jury theorem, actually, the two go hand in hand. I think it says a hell of a lot about our political class in this country in the 2020s that they want to get rid of jury trials, even if it's just for some offences. Because I think the tragedy of this whole thing is if it succeeds, right? If we see this backlog go away, which I think everybody wants the backlog to go away, you want people that are subject to horrific crimes getting justice more quickly. You want people who are falsely accused, putting that behind them more quickly as well. We all want that. But I wonder if that does happen, then all of a sudden you start to hear an argument for, well, maybe we should extend this further. Magistrates now, it's gone from 1 year to 1.5 year sentences. Maybe magistrates can try up to 2 years. We don't have juries up to 5 years. And we just have the Crown Court for sentences of more than 10 years. I think that's a very dangerous place to end up. What do you think? Let me know. The British media can smell blood when it comes to Keir Starmer's government and his Chancellor, Rachel Reeves. These were the questions from the media at a big speech yesterday that was meant to promote measures in last week's budget.
As a former lawyer, you'll be familiar with the concept of people offering the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Isn't the reality that in failing to be candid about the breadth of what she knew at her pre-budget news conference, the Chancellor misled us?
We found out from the Office of Budget Responsibility that the Chancellor, with your backing, misled the public on November the 4th when she warned about a black hole in the public finances without telling us the second bit, that higher than expected tax receipts meant the economy was in a much healthier position than the Chancellor publicly suggested to all of us and to the country. A Cabinet Minister has told me this morning they do feel misled.
For my sins, I've reported on budgets for 35 years.
That's a good record.
And truthfully, I have never seen preparations for a budget as shambolic as these, except for Liz Truss's mini budget, and we all know how that ended. Is this the Chancellor's fault?
That was the BBC's Chris Mason, Sky's Beth Rigby, and of course ITV's Robert Peston, all asking about the big row that had dominated the post-budget weekend. As you heard, it concerns whether Rachel Reeves misled the public over the extent of Britain's so-called black hole. It seems pretty obvious that she did. On the 4th of November, Rachel Reeves gave an impromptu press conference where she warned tax rises might be necessary to fix the public finances. In that speech, she blamed a productivity downgrade by the OBR. A week later, she again touted tax rises. In an interview to the BBC on the 10th of November, she again refused to rule out a manifesto breaking hike in tax rates. Again, she blamed poor productivity projections from the OBR, which, to be clear, were very real. That was happening. But then there was a U-turn, because that wasn't the whole story. On the 13th of November, Treasury sources briefed the Financial Times that the government had dropped its plan to increase income tax rates. We were going to see 2 pence on the basic rate, apparently. The FT reported that was because there had been a £10 billion upgrade from the OBR. And the BBC reported this. Rachel Reeves has decided against raising income tax rates at the budget after receiving better than expected economic forecasts, government sources have said. In recent weeks, the Chancellor had given strong indications she would increase the tax, a move that would have broken Labour's election promise not to raise, quote, the basic, higher or additional rates of income tax. However, as first reported in the Financial Times, the Chancellor has decided not to proceed, following estimates suggesting a gap in the public finances is £10 billion smaller than previously thought. As a document released by the OBR after the budget makes clear, by the time of Rachel Reeves' doom-laden speech on the 4th of November, there had already been 2 upgrades, not downgrades, on the OBR forecasts. And there was no change in their pre-measures forecast between when Reeves suggested tax rate rises would be needed and her U-turn on that same question. In short, a U-turn which she wanted to make out as due to changed projections was in fact just due to political weakness. Remember, this was the week Downing Street tried and failed to take out one Wes Streeting. This might all seem rather technical, rather pointless, but it is why Rachel Reeves had to field questions like this one all weekend.
The Leader of the Opposition said about the choices that you made that, I'm quoting here, for months, Reeves has lied to the public to justify record tax hikes to pay for more welfare. Did you lie?
Look, I'm a Labour Chancellor. I want to reduce child poverty. I make no apologies for that. This will be the biggest ever reduction in child poverty in a parliament ever. And I'm proud to be the Chancellor that lifts 500,000 kids out of poverty. That means kids not going to bed hungry. It means kids not waking up in cold and damp homes. And I am proud and I'm very happy to defend the choices I've made.
I just asked you, did you lie? And I have to say, the answer I was looking for was no. I didn't hear the word no.
But you also asked about welfare in that question.
No, I just asked you, did you lie?
Of course I didn't.
Did you lie? Yes, of course I lied. To be fair, that's probably what Donald Trump would say, right? This whole row is because the OBR released data about all of this, that the Treasurer... The OBR... This whole row is because the OBR released data about what the Treasury knew and when, which Reeves would not have known they would publish. And if Reeves and Starmer held any resentment towards the organisation, that is the OBR, today they might be feeling a little bit happier. There might be a spring in their step. And that's because the OBR's chair resigned yesterday. His resignation was not due to this particular row and whether or not Rachel Reeves is a liar, but rather the absurd error of releasing the OBR's detailed response to the budget 40 minutes before the budget was actually delivered. Poor old Rachel. We now know how that happened. The OBR had uploaded the document as a PDF with an easily guessable name. This is from Sky's Ed Conway on X. He's written a great book. The person who first downloaded the OBR's document at 11:35 on budget day, I'm guessing someone at Reuters, given they first reported it, had already guessed the web address and tried and failed to download it 32 times so far that day. And you can see there was the link, it was ready to go out, and they were just refreshing, and eventually they got there. Kieran, I guess people are watching this story. The budget was last week, the middle of last week. We're still talking about it. My sense is that the Mail on Sunday, Sky News, the whole press pack are going after Rachel Reeves because they thought, and hold on, hold your hats, folks. I'm going to defend Labour here. I'm going to defend Rachel Reeves. Don't unsubscribe just yet. Hear me out. They expected Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer to be politically damaged, to see their status diminished after this budget. And actually, because they got rid of the two-child benefit cap, which is unpopular with the public more generally, it gave them enhanced status within the Parliamentary Labour Party. It means a coup against Starmer is very unlikely this year. It'll probably happen now after next May's local elections. Rachel Reeves is safe in post. And most importantly, the markets liked the budget, okay? 5-year yields on UK gilts, which basically determines the interest rate at which we can borrow on international markets to finance public spending here. That's fallen, which means that the interest on our debt is falling. It's not going up. It's basically the opposite of what was happening with trusts. And I don't know what you feel about this, Kieran. I feel that the media is really frustrated that they didn't have this car crash story. And let's be real, they don't care about the country doing well. They care about anger, eyeballs, attention, and of course, people's heads turn, they rubberneck when they see something very bad happen. And that effectively is what I think the media wanted from this budget. It didn't happen. I've got no dog in this fight. I can say that, right? I'm not a Labour supporter, but I'm also not writing for the Mail on Sunday. So they've had to really confect something else where they can just end up saying, the Chancellor should now resign. I saw Matt Goodwin sent out an email on his Substack. He was saying, Rachel Reeves should now resign. As if Matt Goodwin was going to say anything else after the budget. The point is there's no smoking gun, so we're kind of getting a non-story in its place. What do you think?
So now I've got to be good cop or bad cop, depending on whether you're left or Labour. What I think is that there's certainly an element of truth to that. I mean, most of the right-wing media will line up and sharpen the knives and say that things are omni-shambles and so on if you're to the left of Tony Blair. And maybe even if you're to the right of Tony Blair. I don't doubt that plays into this quite significantly. And I think, the examples you give are totally legitimate examples. Nonetheless, I can't help but get the sense that this is all just such an ugly, bloody mess. And I think it is an ugly, bloody mess, not just because of the mischief-making or vulture-like behaviour of the media, or Matt Goodwin or anyone else for that matter. I think the lion's share of it arises from the fact that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, everything that they have embodied in their year and a half in government has been incoherent and without guiding vision and without set principles. And because of that, without a firm electoral coalition. I feel a bit like a broken record sometimes when I talk about them, because I know every time they come up, this point of mine does come up, which is that the fundamental flaw was their Faustian pact was, let's not be the Tories and let's be nothing so that people can project onto us what they want. And then they won a 175-seat majority from that. But of course, the tax, if you like, of doing politics that way is that it is an incredibly friable and fragile majority. And we've seen that in the vaporization of said majority in a year and a half. And I think that fundamentally is because there is no vision and there is no corresponding electoral coalition with that vision. Harold Macmillan, Tory Prime Minister from 56 to 64, famously said that British politics is mostly just muddling through. That phrase, muddling through. Sure, but, every government has to do a lot of muddling through and the officers of state principally muddle through. But most of the time that is, well, maybe not most of the time, maybe decreasingly actually in the information or the internet age. That's a fair, I think, caveat to make. But generally speaking, most governments historically have managed to muddle through and still project a kind of direction in what they're doing and make their marquee policies the things that the press talks about. And if the press won't talk about it, if the press will only talk about your blunders and about the muddling through, and if that's on the surface and the bonnet is up, then you at least have your coalition, your electoral coalition that will stand up for you when the chips are down, so to speak. The problem is that because Keir Starmer dispensed, and his gurus dispensed of the need for a strong, a firm electoral coalition that will stand up for you when the chips are down, when the media is doing what it did around this budget. I don't dissent from your view, Aaron, on that. It means that muddling through becomes the clear, apparent feature, and it becomes the defining feature. So I think it's an incredibly shambolic and depressing state of affairs. And it's true, I don't know what it will take. We've only had chaos in government over the past 5, 6, 7 years. So maybe that is just the new central tendency of British politics. I'd like to think not. But I disagree. I mean, I don't think you were saying this, Aaron, but I disagree that it was a good budget or a budget that any of us... There are elements of it that were positive because this Labour government's political bandwidth has shrunken so dramatically with its evaporated majority. And so credit where it's due, I suppose. But overall, I think that this is, as I say, a shambolic state of affairs and incredibly messy, very, very messy.
I don't think it was a bad budget. This was a budget far to the left of anything I expected from Rachel Reeves as Chancellor. Not necessarily Keir Starmer, because I believe Keir Starmer wants to get rid of the two-child benefit cap, right? But it's on record for a really long time that Rachel Reeves, Morgan McSweeney were the two people that were really resistant to this happening. Of course, it's happened in order for the Labour Party to effectively regain its parliamentary majority again. They weren't able to pass legislation, and this has basically been a down payment on them passing future legislation, including, by the way, cuts to welfare. And they've done something they didn't want to do. You've got a mansion tax on properties worth more than 2 million, about 100,000 homes. You've got quite smart, I think, applying VAT, for instance, to Uber, for instance. Hackney cabs and London black cabs don't pay that. You're putting an extra cost on big tech. I think that's good. Other things too. So look, I don't think it's a great budget. I would like a wealth tax. I would like capital gains to go up. They also increased dividends tax, very marginally, but they did increase dividends tax. So there are lots of people out there, landlords, who they pay themselves an income, they pay themselves a wage, but it's lower than the tax thresholds. They don't pay any income tax because they earn less than £12,500 a year, and they pay themselves via dividends instead. And of course, dividends are taxed at a lower rate than incomes. And you might be thinking, well, that's really a pain in the ass, and you just pay yourself dividends once a year. You can pay yourself dividends every month. It can be identical to an income. And those people, self-employed, etc., who do very well, they pay comparatively much less into the tax system than someone on PAYE. They're now paying a little bit more. I think that's good, right? So I think you have to give credit where it's due. Did I vote for this Labour Party? No. Will I vote for Labour in the next general election? No. Do I think Rachel Reeves is a great politician or a great chancellor? Not really. But it's also unfair, isn't it, Kieran? Because if you said to you or me, prior to Labour coming into office, over two budgets, they're going to increase the tax take by around 100 billion, maybe even more, I don't know. They're going to get rid of the two-child benefit cap. You've got a mansion tax, dividends tax is up, minimum wage is doing really well. They're going to fund the NHS. They're going to give a little bit of money back to local authorities. Of course, really, we want it to go back to where it was in 2010. You would say, well, you know what? That's a start. That's the left of Ed Miliband in 2015. How would you respond to that?
But it's completely incommensurate to the challenges, the structural challenges that our economy faces. They staked everything on growth. And I mean, there's been flatlining growth. There haven't been the measures necessary to stimulate growth. By the way, I'm not an absolutist about these things. I don't think that you have to come in with a totally revolutionary socialist program. Otherwise, I'm not going to throw you any nugget of praise. But I would say that to lose a majority of 175 seats, well, we don't know what their majority would be today if they would have one at all. Probably unlikely that they would based on all the polling. But let's assume that they wouldn't let's assume the polls are correct. I think that that's inevitable when you don't have a coherent program. Removing the 2-child benefit cap is not insignificant. I'm not saying it is. It's not insignificant. But unfortunately, everything seems to evaporate because it isn't framed within a wider narrative about the direction of the country and what it all means. And that isn't just a discursive thing. That isn't just a narrative thing. It's because there isn't a coherent trail of policy as far as I'm concerned. The things you've mentioned, as I say, are not insignificant. But it's not framed within a wider industrial strategy or direction for the country or direction for public services. And ultimately, I fall back on what I said before. It's completely incommensurate to the structural challenges that the economy faces. If really what they wanted was to grow the economy, my God, they're going to have to do a hell of a lot more than they've been doing.
Yeah, but also, look, maybe because I'm in this chair, I'm kind of through some form of, spatial osmosis. I'm becoming like Michael Walker. I mean, the economy is not growing, but it's still the second fastest growing in the G7, right? By the way, if you look at per capita growth, it's not growing. It's because there are more people working here, but it's still doing better than other places. We've had 3 cuts to interest rates. If you'd said all of this is really hard because people get accustomed to this stuff really quickly. But if you said 18 months ago, Labour are going to come in, they're going to increase these taxes, they're going to get rid of the 2-child benefit cap, they're going to fund the NHS, there'll be 3 interest rate cuts, second fastest growing economy in the G7. I don't think anybody, you have to be fair, I don't think anybody would be saying, you know what, I reckon all that will happen and Labour will be polling 15% in the polls. Nobody would say that, which I think that leaves you with one or two options. Either Labour are just terribly bad at communications, like terribly, right? They should be polling at least substantially better than they are, even with the same policy offer, even if you think that Reform and Farage would be shaping the broader political conversation, which I think they would be. They should be doing a lot better, or something really strange is structurally happening to British politics. I suspect it's a bit of both. It feels like we talk about Zack Polanski most weeks that I do this show. But that's not overkill. I promise, not what you think about it. After all, the Greens now have over 175,000 members and regularly poll second and even third, sometimes with credible pollsters. Last week, in just 24 hours, the party raised more money after a fundraising video went viral than they did for the first half of 2025. They raised more money in one day than in 6 months. The campaign for that is called Hope is Here. The crowdfunder so far has raised £215,000, with the stretch goal being £250,000. That's a decent pot for local elections next May. But last week had its downs as well as its ups for the Green Party leader. Appearing on the Rest is Politics podcast alongside Rory, Stewart and Alistair Campbell, Polanski arguably came unstuck a few times. First up, his question regarding how much Britain pays as interest on its public debt.
How much are we spending every year on debt interest?
So actually, of all people, Rich Tice has been saying the same thing. During COVID, we gave loans to the Bank of England.
You can't give me a rough figure on how much we're spending on debt interest every year?
Well, there's £70 billion that we owe to the Bank of England, but we don't actually owe that money.
You mean the debt or the deficit?
The debt.
Okay, the debt is
the deficit, sorry.
Okay, we are spending £100 billion annually on debt interest, right?
Is it 11% of everything?
Debt interest, huge amount of money.
Right.
So one of the things I suppose I'm getting at
but what I'm getting straight back at you is we don't need to spend that money. So that money has been created as an idea. We're spending that money straight back to ourselves.
This is my point about the change. We do need to spend that money now because that is how we borrow the money from the markets to fund the things that we're funding. And so one of the reasons why, and I know you're not happy with the sort of economic performance and the performance more generally of the Labour government, one of the reasons why they do have to be conscious of the market reaction to something like a budget is because if they get it wrong, the markets lose confidence and the costs of borrowing then go further, and we end up spending even more. So that's why I keep saying, how do you get from A to B?
Well, and so now we're really getting to the root of the question. I think it comes to all of what Rory was just saying, because I think we're operating in different paradigms.
Strange answer. And we're not going to criticize Zack in this conversation. Strange answer. Rory Stewart is right that the interest on public debt in this country is 100 billion plus. It has been for multiple years. I'm not talking about the deficit. The deficit is also 100 billion plus. That's different to the debt interest that we're paying. So imagine you've got your overdraft. That's the equivalent of the national debt. And you're paying interest every year on your overdraft. That's the interest. And the deficit might be, how much worse that's getting on a monthly basis or an annual basis. We'll talk about all of those points in a minute. But Zack, I think, should acknowledge that 100 billion is far too much for debt interest. And there's a very easy way to rectify this, by the way. To not run deficits. Very simple, right? Very simple way to not be worried about what the bank thinks of you if you're not having to take credit from it. It's become a left-coded idea that we have to run deficits. Now, I'm not opposed to deficits. I don't think we have to run surpluses, but it's also not the more deficits and the higher the deficits, the more left-wing you are. I don't think that's sensible. China doesn't do that, right? This country, at its peak, at its apogee of social democracy, didn't do that. Western Europe, actually, when it was far more equitable than it is today, and the state had a far larger role, they weren't all running deficits all the time. Okay, France, West Germany, etc. They weren't running deficits. So the idea that running deficits is necessarily left-wing, big mistake. You can say, I think, as a socialist, well, I don't think deficits should be that high. Sure. Public debt shouldn't be that high. The idea that, again, the more left-wing you are, the higher the public debt. Completely wrong way around. Later in the conversation, Polanski was asked about his intellectual influences and his favourite economists.
I'm not an economist. I'm not going to pretend to be an economist. What I am, though, is someone who listens to brilliant economists and a whole range of economists and listens to ideas from around the world. And what I know is that our system is broken. It's not working for anyone. Sorry, it's not working for anyone. It's working for multimillionaires and billionaires who are telling the story about our system.
So, rather than getting into maybe an argument about this,
it's fine. You told me like 20 minutes ago that I wasn't radical enough.
Tell us which economists you're listening to. Who are your intellectual influences here?
Brilliant people. So Grace Blakely, Richard Murphy, who's been doing a lot of work on this, Gary Stevenson, who I know you've had on recently, James Medway.
All friends of the show. And of course, that got a lot of pickup. Lots of people were attacking Zack Polanski for saying those people. They're saying, well, they're not economists. I mean, James Medway is. He did a PhD in economics. But, Gary Stevenson, fine, a trader. Grace, she's worked in consulting and think tank stuff, but, fine. She's not an academic or an economist working for a major financial institution. But there are very, very, very august, significant economists who agree with them. Gabriel Zucman in France, very influential. Thomas Piketty, very influential. Really serious people. Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize winner. Mariana Mazzucato. She was very good friends with some people around Keir Starmer before the last election. So the idea that by arguing and advocating for a wealth tax, no serious economist is doing it. It's just people like Gary Stevenson, who's a very successful author, or Grace Blakely, who's a very successful writer, podcaster, but no serious economists are actually saying this. No, they are. Right? They really are. And just because he didn't come to it like that straight away doesn't mean that that isn't the case. Very, very serious people, Nobel Prize winners, have argued for this. So don't sort of disparage it as something that only a few people with Mickey Mouse blogs are saying. And by the way, Richard Murphy's an accountant. He's not an economist. I think that gives him more credibility, frankly. If somebody was coming to me and they said, I'm an academic macroeconomist at Cambridge, and I think this and this and this about tax avoidance, I'd say, okay, great. If a guy is saying, look, I'm an accountant from Norwich, and I've been working with small and medium-sized businesses for 30 years, and I know all the rules they break and bend to minimize their tax take, and here's what we can do to increase tax revenues in this country by tens of billions of pounds a year. Guess what? I'm going to listen to the accountant. I don't care what university he went to. I don't care what letters are after his name, or whether he's part of the permanent political and media class in this country. I don't care. Park that for a moment. As I've said, very august, significant political figures and economists back a wealth tax, but equally, that's not the whole story anyway. I've got a line here before I go on from Politico Teacher. The UK has almost always ran deficits, and so has every other state Aaron just talked about. He's just wrong. That's not true. Britain has been running permanent deficits basically since neoliberalism. Unless you think neoliberalism is good, which I don't, then we have to revisit that. Britain ran surpluses throughout the entire post-war period, all the way through the early 1980s. The only years that this country has run surpluses, really since Thatcher went into office in 1979, were a couple of years under John Major and a couple of years under Brown Blair. So really over, 45 years, 4 or 5 years, we've been running surpluses. So it's very fair to say, as this chap is, I presume, saying, that we generally run deficits. That's true, but that's an outgrowth of American imperialism and neoliberalism. Okay? When you go back to the golden age of social democracy in Europe, which, by the way, I don't think we can go back to for a ton of reasons, but when you go back to it, that wasn't the case. So this idea that we can just run infinity deficits and have infinity public debt, it's at odds with historic socialist politics and arguments made in this country and elsewhere, of course, like China, as I just said. After speaking to Zack Polanski, the two hosts made some concluding remarks about the conversation. Here's what Rory Stewart had to say.
I was horrified beyond belief on the economic stuff. It's not acceptable. Guy's got almost 20% of the vote in some of these polls, right? He could be part of a coalition government. I stopped calling him out on things because it got so mad. But listeners paying attention, right? He didn't know at all how much we're paying on debt interest. £100 billion a year we're spending on debt. It's twice as much we spend on defense. He needs to know that. Number two, he doesn't know the difference between the debt and the deficit. Right, just to explain for most listeners, right, just in case other people are not. And so, am I being rude to listeners in having to explain this? I presume most of our listeners know, right? The debt is the total amount you've borrowed. The deficit is the amount you're adding to it every year. Thinking that our debt is 70 billion rather than our deficit is underestimating the scale of our debt about 15-fold. Right? And then he didn't know what the top rate of tax was. So, the fact that he's talking about changing taxes when he doesn't know the top rate of tax. I didn't even call him out on that. He said it was 40% rather than 45%. Right? Is it too much to ask that if you're proposing to be leader of a party, and he said to me afterwards, "Oh, you were very unfair. I wasn't ready for those questions. I'm an actor, and I can get up on those things. And if I'd had a bit more warning." For goodness sake, he's claiming to reshape our entire economy. He's got your entire family WhatsApp group going out there saying, let's vote Green. We don't want to go with Labour.
You can't make assumptions about my family WhatsApp group.
And, at least 20,
they say things that I quite like. This Zack Polanski
20%
guy.
of the British public, right? And his economic advisor is Yanis Varoufakis.
Thought.
So I didn't want to be. Obviously it got a bit scratchy there. And normally I reserve my scratchiness for the Michael Goves of this world. But this is not good enough. This is not serious enough. If this is where British politics is going, no.
Well, his advisor was Yanis Varoufakis. Well, you were just saying that he wasn't informed by actual economists. Yanis Varoufakis wrote the book. He wrote the book on game theory that undergraduate economist students get. He wrote the book. They're not real economists. Okay, how about this dude that wrote a book about game theory? No, he magically doesn't count either. I'm thinking it's not just about whether or not they're economists. This guy doesn't even know what the top rate of tax is. He doesn't even know the difference between the deficit and the debt. Rory Stewart became an MP in 2010 when the Tories formed a government. David Cameron was Prime Minister. David Cameron went on the Tonight Show in the United States. He was asked, and this is not a lie, Google this, YouTube it. YouTube the shit out of it. What does Magna Carta mean in English? He didn't know. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. All that money wasted on his Eton education. He didn't know. Do you really think that all those Tory MPs knew the difference between the debt, the deficit, debt interest? I don't believe they did because they made such a horrific bodge job of the economy after they got in. This is the same chap who was in a government whose chancellor was George Osborne, who oversaw an economy where debt to GDP, which is to say the public debt was 60% of the overall economy, debt to GDP was 60%. They said we have to get rid of the deficit, we have to get the debt down. And guess what? Fast forward 2025, public debt is 100% of GDP. They said by 2015, we're going to eliminate the deficit. 5 years later, it's still there. They destroyed the public realm in this country, including things like the Crown Prosecution Service, including things like the prison estate, youth services, triple tuition fees, defund the NHS, defund local authorities. If you walk around your local area now and it kind of looks crappy and you think, wow, it looked a lot nicer 15 years ago, it's because local authorities have been defunded. They've lost about 40 to 50% of their funding over the last 15 years. And that happened with these guys, with Rory Stewart. And he's horrified. I'm horrified of you. I'm horrified of what you did in government, your record. Not what you will do, not what you could do, not what you said on some stupid, pointless interview. Ultimately, it's just words, isn't it? What you did, your record, I'm horrified. It's a big word, horrified. Horror. Horror. I am filled with horror with your record in government. And the truth is, these guys are trying to milkshake duck Zack Polanski. Again, it goes back to the logics of the media. Fear sells. Polarization sells. Hatred sells. Rather than say, you know what? Okay, he didn't say the right people, but it's true. When it comes to a wealth tax, there are very, very significant economists calling for this. They could have said that. If they cared about informing their audience, they could have said that. But they don't. Because it's not about informing anybody. It's about getting your way, about being right. I'm right, he's wrong. If you were so right, why the hell were you working in the Cameron government in 2010 if you're always so right? Maybe, Rory, you're a little bit dumb. Just a little bit. Maybe sometimes you're wrong about stuff. No, I can't be wrong. I was the deputy governor of a province in Iraq. Was that a good idea too? I'm horrified. The man was a literal deputy governor of a province in southern Iraq during the Second Gulf War. I'm horrified. Thanks for letting us know. Kieran, what did you think of Zack's performance on The Rest is Politics?
Well, first of all, let me say there is nothing I find more inspiring than the falsetto tones of an incredulous Rory Stewart. That's the first thing, I think, most important thing. No, I mean, you made the points very well, Aaron. It is pretty astonishing to have Rory Stewart slinging economic mud at Zack Polanski. Now, look, in an ideal world, Zack Polanski would have been a bit sharper on the distinction between the deficit and the debt. In an ideal world, he would have been a bit clearer on the top rate of tax, and he would have been able to name a few contemporary economists, for example, the ones you've named, and a few historical economists. He could have just said Keynes. Keynes is way to the left of anything we see or have today in the mainstream. So he could have said those and passed Rory Stewart's stupid test with flying colours. Nonetheless, those are kind of superficial or cosmetic points. As you said, Rory Stewart was part of a government that was, I think, the most catastrophically economically illiterate government in maybe 60 or 70 years, even more so than Thatcher. I think Thatcher did more harm to the British economy, structurally speaking, over time. But I think Osborneomics was the greatest missed opportunity for the British economy in the post-war period. And actually, as a result of that, the single most expedient agent of British decline, actually. I really, really believe that. And for Rory Stewart to be in a government that refused to borrow when interest rates were zero, something that basically never happens and probably won't happen again, certainly not for a very, very long time, if ever, is completely insane. I mean, it's completely insane whether you're a fiscal hawk or big on deficit spending. It was an act of intergenerational economic vandalism. There's no two ways about it. And I think I've even heard Tories saying, that was a missed opportunity. That was a golden opportunity that we missed, and it was a bad thing. And the reason we missed it was because the deficit and the debt were used so effectively as scarecrows. And so I guess to come back to your point, Aaron, you're right about, it's not ideal to be paying 108, I think it's the figure, 108 billion pounds, at least it was in 2024, 108 billion pounds just servicing the debt, just paying the interest on the debt. Of course, that's not ideal. I think the overall debt is 2.3 trillion, something like that. You want to get those figures down, of course you would, over time, but not at the expense of investment and not at the expense of public services. And I think that speaks to a very core thing about this entire discussion that we're having, and the discussion that Rory Stewart attempted to have with Zack Polanski, which is that deficit spending is a legitimate form of economic management. It's core to Keynesianism. It's absolutely core to Keynesianism. That the worst thing you could do when your economy goes into a downturn period, as it did after 2008, the worst thing you could do is to completely cut back, and for there to be a complete seizing of the supply line of money and investment into the economy. It ends up becoming a vicious cycle, and I think it's a very large part of the explanation as to why the economy has grown in such a lukewarm way over the past 15 years. Now, of course, as I say, ultimately you want to get the spending down, but when the deficit of a debt becomes scarecrows, which caution against investment per se, that's when the problem starts. And the reason, I think it's important to say, the reason that in the 1960s and 70s, the UK didn't run surpluses. I mean, there are various things that were going on in the global economy which make it different to today. But one thing is that the wealthy paid a much higher rate of tax. So the return for the Treasury was higher relative to the other sum total of goods and services in the economy and so on. And that makes a huge difference. The problem now is that so much money is squirreled away. The tax rate has been retrenched to such a degree that governments resort to borrowing because they don't think that they can politically, feasibly recover sufficient funds to keep public services in a complex population growth, pro-population growth society with taxes alone. And so there's a balance there between the two forms in which, or ways in which governments can raise money. That's an important, significant part of the equation here. So yeah, the Rory Stewart is completely discredited on the economy. And I think what this speaks to is Rory Stewart's continual error, which is that he thinks that, careful, technocratic, being across the detail, and ultimately tinkering around the edges is the way to save all societies and to save Britain. People are really hurting, not in small part because of Rory Stewart's former government's policies. They want visionary politics. Of course, they're sensible. They want it grounded in empirical truths and empirical reality, but they want something that breaks with the consensus that Rory Stewart has been such a pivotal figure in.
There's a comment saying that you should go on onto one of these podcasts alongside Zack Polanski next time, his wingman. I'm inclined to agree. Look, this is something that I think people really need to understand. It was very cheap for the government to borrow for most of the 2010s, right? Now, if you're a market capitalist, if you believe in free markets, a price is information. It's a signal, okay? When the price of borrowing for a state is so low, that is a signal from the market saying, borrow the money, invest it in revenue generating things. We can't find many good bets over there out there more broadly for returns. We're willing to borrow to states because there's so much risk elsewhere. Returns are so low. We want a steady, stable thing to invest in. The returns aren't great, but we know we'll get them. Hence, we're going to borrow to you. You're a good bet. It's a signal. It's a piece of information. That's why borrowing is so cheap. Do it. But we had a media and political class in this country, and particularly that government, who were too thick. They have no idea what they're talking about. If you believe in this stuff, if you believe in prices as an expression of information, you would draw that conclusion. They have no idea what they're talking about, right? Dan Wang puts this so well. He says, China has the engineering state. America has the lawyer state. Britain has the PPE state, okay? It's just a bunch of bluffers who basically, look at this stuff as an exercise in marketing and PR. They don't have a substantial knowledge of what they're talking about. And yet one of those very people, like Rory Stewart, is, castigating and slamming Zack Polanski. In addition, the thing about deficits is really key. Keynes says you can use deficits and you can borrow to increase final demand as a counter-cyclical stimulus. When the economy is not growing, you can make it grow by running deficits. The problem we now have in the West since neoliberalism is that deficits are not a counter-cyclical stimulus. We are running deficits all of the time, permanently. And a lot of that is actually, as you've said, to basically have a low-tax economy. That's why we're running all these deficits. It's not a coincidence, right? So you don't have to have high tax rates on wealth. Often we have deficit-funded tax cuts. In the United States, the Clinton administration ran a surplus, again, very unusual in the post-1970s landscape. What happens? George W. Bush gets in, they run a deficit straight away. Why? Tax cuts for the rich. So this idea that, the more the deficits, the bigger, the more left-wing you are. Not true. And I'll finish with this as well. We need some more Keynes. Going back to that first clip of this podcast, these guys do not view John Maynard Keynes as a legitimate economist. He was, without any shadow of a doubt, the most influential economist in the world easily until 1980. Easily. But now it's like he's some random guy who's illegitimate, has no role in public debate. Even Adam Smith. Read Adam Smith. Adam Smith is so far to the left of mainstream economics debate in this country. And again, they have no idea because they did PPE. It's not real. It's not real.
If you asked Rory Stewart, who are your intellectual forebears? Who are your kind of market economy inspirations? He would probably, I'm sure he'd be able to name some. He'd probably say Hayek. He'd maybe say Milton Friedman, maybe von Mises. In any of those individuals, key kind of luminaries of free market capitalism in one form or another, you could absolutely pick empirical holes all the way through them. So this idea that there are these unimpeachable economic thinkers in history and at present, and then there are these kind of pie-in-the-sky thinkers. So much of what Milton Friedman, who's the latter-day godfather of free market economics, so much of what he wrote was absolutely pie in the sky, and only proven so decisively after the financial crisis, by the way, conveniently 2 years after he died. Anyway, just a final observation.
And also, by the way, as a general rule, when somebody says, this person, it's ridiculous, it means I haven't actually got a thought-out, coherent critique of that person or that argument, which I'm capable of explaining to you, so I'm just going to do some grunt. That's why they do that. Kieran, thanks for joining me this evening.
Oh, thanks very much for having me, Aaron. It's for the economics episode. No, we often do economics. It was great fun.
It was great fun. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Come back again tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.